Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and this is another video on how to improve your chess game. Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about micro time management, which is how much time should you take on a chess move, and in particular we're going to look at critical positions in the endgame because they have a special type of time management. I have an idea that I call hand waving. When I run across things that people do wrong consistently, I like to give them names so we can identify them and talk about them. And that one of the names that we've talked about in previous videos is called hand waving. Hand waving is where you have an analytical position, one that requires analysis, but instead you move relatively quickly just using general principles. And if you make a hand waving error, it's a position where you should be analyzing. Is it possible that you can hand wave a position that doesn't require analysis and therefore it's not a hand waving error and it's okay? Sure. Suppose the first move of the game is a3 and you're black and you have no given defense against a3, and you sit there and you figure out how am I going to develop my pieces? What's the first move I should make in this game? It's quite okay to hand wave that position. The pieces are not in conflict. There's no checks, captures, or threats that white will make on the second move that will cause you any problems, so it's perfectly reasonable to hand wave your reply to a3. But as the game goes on and the pieces get more into conflicting with each other and there's more checks, captures, and threats of consequence, then the game becomes more critical. And in the end game, you can't get away with hand waving at all. A lot of people want to figure out what book they should read for the end game to get better at the end game, and the problem is that if you read exact endgame books, books that have specific positions like Pandolfini's Endgame course or Silman's Endgame course, those are very good books, but they cover specific positions like Lucena and Philidor and King and Pawn against King, and I have a two-part video on King and Pawn against King. But the overwhelming majority of endgame positions are not these exact known endgames, but positions that you'll never get into again and that'll never make it into an endgame book. But they can be calculated, and you have to sit there and try to figure things out. In my very first video in this series that we've done here for YouTube, I gave such a position. So I'm going to look at a couple more today. The following position that we're looking at on the board here is a position that was reached by one of my students. And if I don't have the exact position, I don't remember it exactly. This is very, very close. And my student was black, and he was playing in one of the big CCA tournaments where they give you 40 moves for 2 hours, and then they give you an hour for the rest of the game. And in this position, he had about 50 minutes left on his clock to finish the game. He was black, and it was his move. Okay, white had just played h4, I believe. Now, the first question that should come up in a position like this is, how critical is it? Does it really matter what black does here? And if you're not sure how critical it is in a position like this, you should do what like a defensive driver would do, which is assume the worst case. Assume it's very critical, and if it turns out that you're wrong, okay, no big harm done, unless you're in great time trouble and it causes you to get into worse time trouble and mess up. But if you have lots of time on your clock, and here black had 50 minutes to finish the game, then it doesn't do any harm to assume it's critical, and if it's not, it's not. But if it is, then you'll be glad that you assumed it was and that you take your time and carefully analyze the position. So here, basically, black has 50 minutes to finish the game, and he should be able to calculate whether or not his sequences get a queen or not. And if he can get a queen, whether he has an increment or a time delay or not, even if he only has a minute or two left on the clock, he's going to be able to checkmate white without stalemating him, unless you're a very, very low-rated player. Once you have a king and a queen against a king, it shouldn't take you very long to win. And if you have an increment or a time delay, you could basically use no time on your clock. So based on that information, black could actually take, if he needed to, he could take like 45 out of his last 50 minutes to figure this move out. Because if he figures it out and he figures out that he can get a queen, then he could play the next moves, maybe not immediately, but relatively quickly, double checking his analysis, and win the game, assuming he can figure out that he can get a queen. Well, there's three things that black can do here. Black can ignore white's pawn push and just bring his king closer to the pawns with king f3. he can take the pawn with g takes h4, or he could push past the pawn with g4. Those are the three major ideas. Well, after the game, I went back to this position and I said to my student, let me calculate all three of those and tell you which ones are winning and which ones are not winning. So I did it, and it took me about 2 minutes or 3 minutes out loud to go through all three possibilities. And I said to my student, if you had to do this too, which you did, but you didn't, that is, he did have to do it, but he didn't do it, how long would it have taken you? And my student says, well, you're much faster than I am, Dan. It would have taken me 10 minutes. And I said, well, you had 50 minutes to finish the game, and if you took 10 minutes on this move, you'd still have 40 minutes left, but then you'd know what to do and what would be winning and what's not winning. A lot of people I run into say they're not very good at endgames, and when I give them endgame positions, it turns out what they're really not good at is analysis. But they can hand-wave the opening and sometimes get away with it, especially against weaker players. And they can even hand-wave the middle game against weak players and sometimes get away with it. But when they get to positions like this, you just can't hand-wave them. So what did my student do? Well, my student said to himself, all right, I'm winning this position. Why is he winning? Because his king is closer to the white pawns and he's the one trying to win and white's the one trying to draw. He said, Dan gave me a principle. When you're winning, trade. So therefore, it's my move and I should trade. What's wrong with what he did? What's wrong with that kind of hand-waving? Well, the answer is a lot of things are wrong with it. Number one is you shouldn't be hand-waving this position at all. Number two is I never told anybody when you're winning trade. What I told them is if you're ahead in material, make fair trades of pieces, but not necessarily pawns. But a lot of people don't listen to the entire principle. I don't say they don't listen, or when they're reading a book, they just remember when you're winning trade. But there's a lot of positions where you want to trade pawns, and there's a lot of positions where you don't want to trade pawns. What you usually want to do is trade pieces. But here, there's no pieces on the board to trade. So that kind of principle wouldn't really apply, but he didn't know that. He misapplied what he remembered. So he says, I'm going to just trade. So he played g takes h4, white played g takes h4, and now black played something like h5. White played king c2, king f3, king d2, king g3, king e2, king takes h4, king f2, king h3, king g1, and white's king got into the corner and was easily able to get a draw. That wasn't that hard to calculate. If you're black and you calculate pawn takes pawn, you know white's going to take you back. And now you know you're either going to go get that pawn now or you're going to block it first and then get it. You could calculate both of them, but the best case is where you push the pawn first and keep the white king hanging. And now black needs to get this pawn and get his king back to the g2 square to block out the white king, and he just doesn't have time to do that. It's not even that close. The black king certainly can't get the g2 here, and of course the white king can get in the corner with an easy draw. So my student could easily have calculated that. He just didn't. He's not used to doing that, and he hand-waved the position, and he ended up getting a draw. Let's look at the other possibilities. Let's say he had kept the pawns on the board with g4. White could play h5, or he could move the king. Let's say he plays h5, I don't know. King f3, king d2, king takes g3, doesn't matter, king e3, king h2, and now the king is guarding all three squares. King f4, g3, king here, pawn here, king here, g1 queen, king takes h6, and now the easiest win is to do the GTS, go to sleep in the endgame. If you haven't seen my video on that, we have an earlier video. Just play queen here, except it's stalemate, so you can't do that. So the better way to do it is to give him a move first and then do that. So you can't play queen g8. So what you do is you play queen g4, forcing the king away from the pawn. You take off the pawn and you win. Okay, so the only thing you can't do there is stalemate him. If you GTS yourself a little too fast, then it can be a stalemate. All right, so g4, let's do that again. King over, king, well, last time we played h5. Let's say we don't play h5. Now it's going to be even worse. king here, king takes, king here, pawn here, king here, pawn here, king here, pawn queens, king takes. Okay, is queen to g8 a stalemate now? No, but white can try to stalemate himself after queen g8, h5. Now if black doesn't move the queen away, it's a stalemate, so black could play something like queen here. The king's only move is to play here, and now you just go in front of the pawn, and you can zugzwang him away from the pawn. King here, king here, king here, king here, king here, king here, zugzwang, king here, checkmate. Okay, you don't have to figure all that out. You just have to figure out whether you're getting a queen and you're stopping your opponent from getting a queen. Let's try the last idea, which is to play king here. Well, now, white doesn't want to lose both these pawns, so let's say he trades pawns. He takes the pawn, he takes back, and now white can either push the pawn or try to get the king closer. It really doesn't matter. King to d2, king takes g3, king e2, king h2, king f2, here. So what should white have done? He should have played king up here. It wouldn't have helped them. Black can just play here, white will play here. Black will play g4, white will play king g1, and we have king g3, tic-tac-toe. If the king goes in the corner to try for a stalemate, king f2, king h2, g3 check, and black will win. So it turns out g4 wins, king f3 wins, but trade when you're ahead is a draw. So my student drew the game, and he made that move in, I think, less than 30 seconds. So he had 50 minutes, and he took less than 30 seconds. He didn't try to figure it out. So what we have here is a supercritical position. It's a position where black has to figure it out. If he plays the wrong idea, he's going to throw away the win. You have all the time in the world. So to make your move quickly is not only a hand-waving error, it's a time management error. You're not using your time wisely. You have a supercritical position where playing the right idea will win you the game, playing the wrong idea won't. And instead of trying to figure it out, he played quickly. Well, you never ever want to do that. If you have 50 minutes on your clock and you have a position like this, you have to take your time and try to figure it out. If you try to make this move on general principles, if you get the right move, then you're just lucky. Okay, let's try another position. Similar kind of happening here. Number 297. Okay, so this was a game at our mainline chess club, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And white was an expert and black was a 1700 player. And clearly black's the one playing for the win. He's got a king and 2 pawns, and white only has a king and 1 pawn. So black's trying to win, white's hoping to get a draw. What should black do? Is this critical? Well, what did I say before? I said, if you're not sure if this is a critical position, assume that it is, and if it turns out it's not, then there's very little to lose unless you're lower on time. Now, this was a little bit different than the previous game. In this game, black only had about 4 or 5 minutes left to finish the game. So he wants to get, I think he had maybe a 5-second time delay. So he can't take too long on a move, but the question is, when should he take his time? Well, once he gets a queen and he has a 5-second time delay, he should be able to win the game with even 1 second left. So what he needs to do is figure out, when do I need to do what as quickly as he can, and he should take his time, try to figure it the best he can, use almost all his time, and try to analyze the position. But black didn't do that. In this position, it was black's move, and he made his move almost instantly, within a second or two. He played d4, figuring, what the heck, I'll just push that pawn, it can't hurt. White, who was an expert, looked at the board and said, I can play h6. And now black stared at the board and he started to count to see if he could get the white pawn and get his king back down to g2 like we saw in the previous. And he realized he couldn't. And he stared at the board and he analyzed for 2 minutes. He took half his time now. But it's too late. This is not the critical position. The previous position was the critical position. Now it really doesn't matter what black does. He could keep pushing the pawn. He could abandon the pawn and go get the white pawn. It doesn't matter. It's all a draw. And he stared at the board and he stared, and his clock ran down, and then finally he had to move. He made some moves. For instance, king f5, king d3, king g6, king d4, king takes h6, king e3, king g5, king f2, king g4, king g2, easy draw. Well, could black have done better? Suppose black had instead played h6. Well, now white can't get closer to this pawn. He has nothing better than king d2. But now black can abandon the pawn, and white has to go all the way up and get it. And making the king go all the way up there gives you time to bring your king back to g4, and when white plays here, you can play king g3. Now, if white plays king f5, you can play h5, h4. But if he plays king e3, you can play h5, and if he plays king e2, threatening to draw with king f1, if you don't believe me, I once saw one of my son's friends play a move like h4 here, and it was an immediate draw. But the winning move, of course, is king g2, and then the next four moves are to get a queen. So this is the critical position. If black plays a move like h6, it's not the only winning move. I think Stockfish says there's a couple others. But d4 is a draw. h6 is a win. I believe king f5 is a win. I believe even king d4 is a win. But he played d4, black played d4 immediately. So after the game, I went back to this position, and I said to my friend, I said, what do you call that move d4? And he said, well, it was a blunder. And I said, yes, a blunder is a bad move. It's a bad mistake. What kind of mistake is it? He says, it's a blunder. I said, well, I'm not arguing about that. I'm just trying to categorize it. He says, I don't know. It's a blunder. And I said, well, it's two things. It's a time management mistake because you played the move in like 1 second, and that's not how you should manage your time in these kind of positions. You need to take some of your time here, not on the next move. On the next move, it's too late. So it's a time management error. Also, it's a criticality mistake. You think that this position is not that critical and that you can push the pawn, but actually it is critical. If you push the pawn, you throw away the win, and if you calculate and figure out what other things you can do, you might be able to win. So black, by playing quickly here and not recognizing the criticality of the position, throws away the win again. And this time black was a much stronger player than black was in the previous game. All right, let's take another position out of my library. Let's almost take one at random and look at the criticality. Let's look at number, 234. I don't even know what this is. Endgame problem. Let's take a look. Okay, so here it's white's move, and black has just played rook d2 to try to stop the pawn from queening. And white has several ways he can stop black from taking the pawn. He could play rook to d5 to force the trade of rooks. He could play king to e6 to try to guard the pawn and usher it in with the king. So the question is it critical which one he does? Well, my guess off the top of the head would be yes. Let's calculate rook to d5. You can't just hand wave and say rook d5 blocks the rook, that's good. You have to actually calculate. Rook d5, black will play rook takes d5 check. If white gets a queen, black will take the queen, so white has to recapture king takes d5. Then black will play king c7, threatening to play king takes d7, and white will play king e6, threatening to play king e7 followed by d8 queen. So we've got rook d5, king c7, rook d5, rook takes d5 check, king takes d5, king c7, king e6, king d8 forced. But now what can white do? Black's threatening to play f4, but how can white stop that? If white then plays king e5 to stop f4, black can play king takes d7, and black is up a pawn, and white can't go after that g6 pawn because by the time he gets it, black will play f4 and get a queen. So let's calculate that line. Rook d5, rook takes d5, king takes d5, king c7, king e6. If king d8, then we saw that king to e5 is losing to king takes d7, so he has to play king f6, and then f4, and then let's say king takes g6, then black plays, let's say f takes e3, h5, e2, h6, e1 queen, h7, and then a move like queen c3 wins because the queen is guarding the h8 square. If you can't visualize that, occasionally I have people saying, Dan, when you play out those lines, you have to show them to us because I can't visualize them. Well, the whole reason I do it in my head is because that's what you have to do in a game, and if I move the pieces around, then I can't say or this or that or this. I have to show all the lines. And you want to learn how to visualize, because if you don't practice visualizing, then you won't get better at it. You know, getting better at visualizing requires practice. But after I finish, then I can show you. So I looked at a line like this. Rook here, rook takes, king here, king here, king here. And now king here is hopeless. Doesn't do anything. Doesn't attack the pawn. Doesn't save the pawn. Just stops black from winning immediately. So rather than stopping black from winning and then letting him take the pawn, and then white's practically in Zugzwang, let's show that line though. King here, king takes. I can't go here because of here. So if I try to hang on, black will just go here. White can go here. Now black could hang on to the pawn if he wants. Try to put white in Zugzwang. King here. If king back, then king f4, and he is in Zugzwang. If king h6, king here. Pawn here, pawn takes, king takes. And now pawn here. If king g4, then simply f3. I could probably even take the pawn, but f3 wins because king g3, and then I bring my king over and I win the b4 pawn. So what we're going to do is we're going to go right after the g pawn right away. So the other line I looked at was king e6, king here, pawn here, king here. Pawn takes, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here, pawn here. Queen, pawn here, queen c3. That's what I looked at before. Okay, so we can see now that rook d5 doesn't work. But suppose white just plays king, excuse me, e6. But isn't white winning now? Because black doesn't have time to win this pawn. White's going to get a queen. So black has to play a move like f4. But now white will just take it. And when black plays e3, white will play rook to e5. Well, probably not. Probably doesn't have to play rook e5 yet. He can play king e7 first. And if e2, then rook e5. And now if the king comes back, oh, what should white play here? I probably could have done better a little earlier. Let's go back a move. So let's let Stockfish play it for me so I don't have to analyze it in real time for you, because the video is not that long and I would take my time. So black plays f4. As we said, he has to play something like this. E takes f4, e3. King e7, e2, and now it says white should not play rook e5, which after king c7 is winning with rook c5 check, but rather play rook to c1. And now if black plays rook to d1 to try to win, anything but rook d1 will lose to pawn up queen, and then black loses. So let's look at rook d1, and I think white can just trade everything off and win. Rook takes, pawn takes, queen, pawn up, queen check, queen takes queen, king takes queen, king c6, king e7, king here, king f6. If he tries to go after this pawn, the h pawn will queen, but if he tries to go after the b pawn, then white wins the race. And now white could play queen f5 and then queen b1 with a go to sleep like we saw before. Or if you don't know how to do that, you could even just play queen to b8 And when he plays king c2, you play h5, and when he gets a queen, you say, thank you for letting me trade, but I can get another queen over here, and you win. So, in this critical position, white has to play king to e6. Let's ask Stockfish if he has any other winning move. Stockfish says, yes, you do. You can play the tricky h5. And other than that, things get a little tougher. If king f6, you're only up +2 instead of +55. After rook d5, so you see white's winning here. It's mate in 19. After rook d5, now it goes to -9. So black is winning. So this is super critical. You only have 2 moves that make any sense here. After d7, rook d2, one move loses and the other move wins. If you don't take your time and try to figure that out, if you just use some sort of general principles like, oh good, I'll block the rook and stop him from taking my pawn, that's hand waving. That's exactly what you don't want to do. You want to take your time and try to figure it out. You want to try to analyze. If you're not very good at it, practice may not make perfect, but practice will make you better. But if you play these moves fast and then you complain to someone else, oh, the reason I play these moves fast is because I'm not very good at the endgame, well, you're making it a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's not because you haven't gone over to study more Silman's endgame book or Pandolfini's endgame course or any other endgame book. This position is not going to be an endgame book, and the endgame book's not going to tell you what to do in this position. You have to learn how to analyze. You can't just lean back and say, well, I'm not very good at the endgame, so I'm not going to try to figure this out. You have to practice it. If you don't practice it, you won't get better. I'm not telling you if you practice it, you're going to get it right every time. You won't. Even good players make mistakes in complicated endgames. But we try to figure them out, and that's the whole point of these criticality and the endgame videos that we're doing here. We're trying to show you the time management for these moves. You need to take your time if you have it on your clock. And you got to take your time and do the analysis. If you don't do the analysis, then you're definitely going to be bad at the endgame, but it won't be because you don't know enough principles. It won't be because you haven't learned enough exact endgames from those endgame books. It's because you're not analyzing, you're not really trying, and that's what makes you weak in the endgame. And we don't want you weak in the endgame. We want you to say, I saw Dan's videos on how to analyze in the endgame and how to take your time and how to visualize and all these things. And I tried and I practiced and I slowly got better at it. That's what we want. We don't want you to be one of those people who tells everybody, well, I did it wrong because I'm bad at the endgame. Okay, if you enjoyed today's video, please hit the like button. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, hit the subscribe button. And we will see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye.